thinks, or government has evidence that there are some sites that the CIL rates are set at a lowest common denominator, and some sites could pay more than the CIL rates imply. And the government's suggesting the way to tackle that is by using existing use value as part of the CIL calculation. The example would be an agricultural field which has a fairly low existing use value, but obviously that is uplifted a lot when a site gets planning permission for development. And the idea being that using existing value will enable more of that value to be captured through CIL. Fourth factor is around increased transparency, and the consultation is proposing that an infrastructure funding statement be published which sets out in more detail, or would set out in detail, how much funding had been collected, what it's projected to be spent on, and such like. And finally, strategic infrastructure tariff. The consultation again doesn't provide much information on this, but is implying that, and it's actually taken the lead from London, where the mayor implies a strategic infrastructure tariff for, as the name implies, strategic transport infrastructure. An example being Crossrail, and effectively the implication is that effectively there'd be two CILs that would apply a strategic infrastructure and then a local infrastructure tariff, a local as well. So just to wrap up, taking account of any additional changes or alterations the committee wants to make, officers will prepare a response to the two consultations and make sure that's submitted by the 10th of May. And we also propose that when the new NPPF is issued, that we arrange member training to ensure members and officers are fully aware of the new content of the guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lee. I'll start on this one, if I may. There's an enormous amount of detail in this, but I'm just going to focus my comments on two areas of particular concern. I think when we've talked about the consultation white paper last time, one of the phrases that was used, that it was a very blunt instrument that was being used to address the housing crisis that the country faces. Something I've thought a lot about. The housing crisis is an extremely tough nut to crack nationally. And we're not talking about a walnut, we're talking about a coconut. And it probably does need a pretty blunt instrument to really make an impact. But what really worries me in what we're reading here and what we're beginning to understand is this concept of unmet need having this domino effect. So London can't do it. Sevenoaks are probably a bit green belted up. Tunbridge and Malling will come up with something and it lands in Maidstone. And I think we've already established that we are probably on that cusp of the 40% affordability uplift. And I'm deeply concerned that unmet need is going to be added to the 40%. And the more I think about it, do not believe that that's right. And I would like our consultation response to actually stress that if we're faced with that upper limit of the 40%, unmet need does not add to that. So I really would like our response to scream that. Equally, I don't think the unmet need should be ignored. And I think when we looked at this, first understanding this principle of the market affordability uplift, we recognised that some areas actually didn't just get off lightly, but they probably ended up with lower numbers. So I think that principle of unmet need should continue to domino so that where it's unmet, it goes to the next. And where it's unmet because either it can't be met or the 40% is breached, that it carries on and would eventually go back to some of these areas that we're getting off too lightly by comparison. Yes, it should keep going until there's some headroom in that 40%. So there's two parts to what I'm asking might be expressed in our response, and I'll be very interested to see if other members will support me in that. The other area I would like us to dwell upon is the SIL. And as time marches by, I'd just like to put it on record that my confidence in SIL being the most appropriate tool is wavering. Partly it might be because I don't understand the detail well enough, but that is sometimes borne out of if I ask two different people, I get three different answers. So for example, SIL, it's a set tariff, it's per square metre, we understand that. We've got a 1, 2, 3 list of what our priorities are, but it's my understanding that if it's on the 1, 2, 3 list, you can't use 106s in addition. So I think about perhaps some of the bigger pieces of infrastructure that we need. Might be a school, might be a new piece of road, I don't know. But if it's on the SIL list, then I'm not sure that by being in SIL our hands aren't tied to ask developers for more money through a more direct route of 106. So do you see the concern that's developing? And I really need a bit of reassurance from officers or that we need to perhaps just revisit this and double check that we are doing the right thing. I'm mindful that through conversations with neighbouring authorities, perhaps Swale and T&M are not going the SIL route. It's kind of perverse if you don't go with the SIL, if you back out of SIL, the pooling restrictions are not relaxed on the 106. And it's the pooling restrictions that I think we were trying to face up to when we went as confidently as we did with the SIL. But I do just wonder whether we should pause for a moment in our process and either reassure ourselves we've got the right thing on the table or look at alternatives. So they're the two big points that I wanted to make. And again, I'm interested to see if that's just me with a concern or whether that's shared by others. I'll start with Councillor English and then we'll progress anti-clockwise.
Just on a procedural point, Mr Chairman, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but the government isn't actually, as far as I can see, asking us to comment on that particular issue unless I've missed it, because that is a question of whether a particular route is appropriate for this particular local authority. I mean, we could perhaps phrase that differently and raise a concern about whether SIL is flexible enough and the clash with the Section 106 priority raises issues that were unintended by the government. That could possibly be a way of adding to the response.
So I think if I'm understanding you correctly, we could actually ponder whether our response should say we want some flexibility in this regard.
Yes.
With SIL.
Yes.
I think I am...
I think what I'm saying is that the government should be aware of the law of unintended consequences here, and if the SIL is structured in such a way as it prevents certain things coming forward because you then can't address it, that may not be what the government intended, so we could respond accordingly.
Law of unintended consequences, or as another one of our colleagues will always refer to, that hostage of fortune.
Yes.
I think the moment somebody said localism and then said set your own target, we've been on a pinball game ever since being bashed from buffer to buffer.
So I'll offer that as a suggestion.
So I take your suggestion. I'd like to just go a little further.
I did have two other points.
Yeah, I'd come back to you. But on that SIL matter, so we could put something into our response, granted. But what I am just saying to the committee is, you know, and we're talking about our successors come post-May events. Should that be on the, let's do a sanity check and say, yeah, do you know what, it is still the right thing, or you know, should we reconsider that? Two points. But back to you, Councillor English. I'm not saying any more for now.
On that precise point, Mr Chairman, it might be appropriate to revisit that once the government's response to the consultation is formally published, and not, at that point.
Our adoption date gets closer sooner, perhaps, than the outcome of this.
All I'm saying is that, that there are reasons for suggesting that, because depending on what path the government takes in terms of this consultation, there may or may not be things we can do. But there we go. On to the other 2 points I was going to make. Continuing with the theme of the law of unintended consequences, I think I would say that in terms of the statement of common ground, there is a danger, and I think it's probably worth mentioning this in our response. I don't disagree with anything else that's been said, but there is actually a risk that the government's position on this will actually make it much harder to actually adopt a local plan that is compliant with their policy objectives. In other words, it's actually going to be very, very hard in many circumstances to make a statement of common ground under the process they're talking about here. And I think it is worth flagging up, but it might actually make the whole local plan process extremely difficult. That has been said in a way, but I think what needs adding is something like what I just said, that the effect might be perverse in the sense that the proposals actually make delivering a local plan much harder. By contrast, I would like to commend the government's proposals under neighbourhood plans. I think there has been a lot of discussion, and you will know, Mr Chairman, and Mr Jarman will know, as will Councillor Wilson, that for quite some time, Councillor Harwood and I have been rambling on at great length about how we need to have more finesse in terms of housing need assessments in the borough. Potentially, this clause 127 would allow us to actually look at this in finer detail. But I do agree that government guidance on how to do this and how to prepare, for better sense of the word, could be described as a local housing need assessment is required, because without that framework we could end up in quite a difficult position. But potentially this could address a lot of the issues that some parishes and some communities, in my own ward for example, have flagged up about the inappropriate size and tenure mix coming forward for those particular communities. So I strongly support that, but although I would just say that we probably need a specific reference to saying that the guidance should cover local housing need assessments or something like that. But otherwise, I fully support it.
It's all in that where the draft MPPG states that there is no set method of how that's the killer stroke.
There needs to be not necessarily a sort of rigid framework, but there needs to be some guidance.
Completely agree. And yeah, I tried to stick to 2 main topics, but the other one that's got loads of black stars and underlined does relate to the statements of common ground, so I'm glad you've raised that. Councillor Willis.
Could we ask Head of Planning for a general view on the, because there's a simple issue here that's been discussed, but the National Policy Framework, which was, I've certainly asked them some questions by email, but what the response, the information that's given out by the government on the 5th of March, I understand not fully as well, I think it's a little bit convoluted and confusing for a simpleton like me. Could we ask our Head of Planning, just because I think it's such an important issue, because Maidstone has been through the mill absolutely through not having a local plan, and now we have one, which is a difficult local plan we've got to deliver. If we're being looked to review this in 5 years' time, can we ask our Head of Planning just to give us a little bit of guidance on where we're going with this in terms of the 5-year review, please?
I'm kind of reluctant to do that, given that we've got local plan review workshop, I think it's next week, and that would be a better forum to get into that. So if you don't mind, I'll sidestep that for now. Anything further to add, Councillor Willis? Councillor Mrs Wilson?
I'll make this very short and sweet. There's a lot in here to take on board, but actually I agree, I think, entirely with responses that the officers have made, where they say we support this or we're pleased to see this. I am in agreement, and where they again raised the concerns, if you could toughen that up a little bit, I'd be happy. But actually, you are making the correct points to my mind on the issues that are of extreme concern. Housing need is a huge issue, particularly this issue that we've delivered year in, year out, and like so many other councils, get penalised because of it. And the only point I'd make here is that I hope we are working very closely with the officers across Kent, because at the last Kent leaders meeting, with one exception, all the district leaders were saying that enough is enough, without actually getting better infrastructure and better understanding from government about infrastructure, and actually needing to address some of the existing situations before we romped ahead with doing a lot more. And there are complications, aren't there, with migration from London as well. So it's a very complicated issue, but I would earnestly suggest that there's a lot of mileage to be made now, with the Kent leaders working together to talk to government and the Kent officers working together to talk to government, because there's a great deal of agreement about the issues that are facing all of us now, to varying degrees, but a real sense that Kent is perhaps too much under the cosh now. And there's got to be a better understanding from central government about the issues that are particularly severe for us in this part of the country. So thank you. I want to thank you, the officers, for the work they've put into this, and say, yes, I'm going to support it, obviously.
Councillor Mrs Springer.
Thank you. I support what Councillor Wilson said. I'd like to see the wording a little bit stronger in places, actually. My concerns come from the fact that in 1.12 we do comment that we are sort of at the mercy of the house builders, who, in order to maintain their house prices, will restrict their delivery. Now, that's always been the case, but when you then compare that to 1.15, which brings in the housing delivery test, it then threatens to put us, we're at the mercy of developers, in whose interest it is if we don't have a 5-year land supply. And not only that, there's a double whammy in that if we don't do this housing delivery test, they're going to cut the new homes bonus. So I'm afraid, got by the short and curlies are the words that spring to mind, I'm afraid. And I would like to see some much stronger wording to reflect the fact that we're caught in a trap and we're still at the mercy of developers providing the flow. Just quickly before you respond on that, perhaps we should consider earmarking some of our own land somewhere where we could erect 200 prehabs, 300 prefabs, if necessary, to stop that from happening. In other words, if you don't provide the numbers of houses because you're trying to restrict delivery, well, we'll put some up. And we'll keep our 5-year land supply that way and keep our new homes bonus. That's just an idea, but my concern is that we are stuck and we are beholden to developers and their rate of build.
All those in favour? Yeah. Okay.
Just one point in response to that, and I think that's a point we made last time round, and absolutely we can make it again, in that the housing delivery test is acting on the councils when it's not entirely in our. We do our bit in terms of granting permissions, but we don't actually build the houses. Just for information, really, the government at the moment, I think it's Oliver Letwin, is leading a review into exactly that issue about why developers maybe, or what needs to happen in order to developers to build out more quickly. So it is something the government's looking at, but we could perhaps weave that as well into our response, that the government should act on the outcomes of what Oliver Letwin finds.
Sounds good. Councillor Wiggenden.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Most of my points have been mentioned already. The statement of common ground and the possibility of getting that when authorities have very, very different objectives was the first thing that came through to me from this. We've gone through actually an awful lot of pain to avoid the presumption in favour of sustainable development, only for the housing delivery test to bring it back to us. And adding the unmet need that you very clearly put out, and then you find you're trying to do this, and this statement of common ground actually bashes you straight in the front. So the stronger we can put that, the better. I would just want one small point. I want on a different issue, because that has been said. But the small sites item here, the requiring councils to ensure at least 20% of the allocated sites are small sites. That seems, as has been said, almost undeliverable completely. I mean, lots of these sites which were delivered in the past were delivered by small companies which went out of business a decade or so ago. And so, we know that there is a lack of skilled workmen, full stop. But actually, the companies, the small companies which used to deliver these, simply don't exist anymore.
It's almost that repeating theme. Broadly, we know there's an amount of housing that needs to be delivered, and then we're getting all these little sub-clauses. Oh, but if you fail on that one, that'll go on, and a bit of unmet from over there, and that's why I'm particularly concerned that we could establish that up to 40% uplift is an absolute, and then it rolls on. So, I think we've had our say. Perhaps Councillor Willis wants one final go. I'm going to allow this because it might be... Oh, sorry. Councillor Willis, I'll come to you, Councillor Mumford. I couldn't see because you're in the transparent zone there.
No, I've only just put my thing up. And when I read through this, I've got reserved comments about the neighbourhood plan there at 127. Yeah, if the autonomy comes over with it, brilliant. But when I read through it, I saw a connection between 119, the small sites, and the neighbourhood plans. And I saw a relationship there that could be had, but I'm still not falling head over heels over neighbourhood plans and allocated. You want the authority to come across with it and then link to the smaller sites, and I can see that working. And I do support your cap 40% on the unmet need.
Thank you. Councillor Willis.
Question for Officer Lee. When's the again, if I've missed this in the notes, when's the deadline for the response?
It's the 10th of May.
Bear in mind I've been told, we have a briefing on it next week, and this is the beginning of the next set of work towards a review of the local plan. Do we not have time to vote on that in the meeting in May?
I think this consultation is happening outside of anything of our control, and delegated to officers will be submission of our response, as we've discussed this evening. Our beginning to think about the local plan review, which perhaps informally starts next week, and by the end of the year will, I'm sure, gather pace. Quite separate.
This committee doesn't decide on a response this evening. There will be no meeting before the 10th of May, at which we can
absolutely
respond.
So I think it's been said that we're grateful to officers for capturing the response that they have, and we support that. There have been a couple of suggestions of bits to go a little bit tougher on, but it's probably as simple as moving as per the papers with those additions. So from the chair moved. Councillor English was there. Quick. Those in favour? Unanimous. Fully supported. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. So was against? Right. 8 for, 1 against. Would you like to push on with the last item, or does anybody need a comfort break? Push on? Right. Agenda item 16, alternative sustainable transport measures, scoping of the next piece of work and the timing. Mrs Arnold, over to you, please.
Thank you, Chairman. First, I need to highlight that there is a missing word on page 87. Please add the word not after the word decides in the first sentence of paragraph 2.4. So the paragraph will now read that the committee decides not to proceed with the investigation of alternative sustainable transport measures, and therefore this option is not recommended, etc. So apologies for that. The report to this committee on the 22nd of January 2018 on the outcomes of both the Tri-Study and the Park and Ride operational review confirmed that the Park and Ride service currently requires £240,000 of subsidy per annum, and for this it removes 165,000 vehicles from the town centre each year. As a result of this, the committee resolved that a full report be brought to this committee by October 2018, which sets out the alternative sustainable transport options and which measures the success or otherwise of Park and Ride based on peak usage. The Council has an important role to deliver the local plan, most importantly for the context of this report, Policy SP23 on sustainable transport, which commits the Council to delivering modal shift. This report outlines the proposed scope for the future report on alternative sustainable transport options, and principally the purpose is to identify what alternative sustainable transport measures are possible and what interventions or facilitation by Maidstone Borough Council could increase uptake. By this I mean more vehicles out of the town centre at peak time usage. It will look to estimate the cost of any intervention where it's possible to do this, with the aim of outlining deliverable alternatives for the same or less money than is currently spent on Park and Ride. The report also suggests a change of deadline to December for the returning report, enabling the inclusion of data from users after the changes to Park and Ride have been implemented on the 1st of June. This would enable any of the changes in the user profiles to be incorporated into the work, and I'm assured that this would still provide sufficient time to make on the basis of the informed decision to either procure a contract extension or implement a close down of the service. This change to the previously resolved deadline would apply to the entire report, and so would also include the measures of success or otherwise of Park and Ride based on peak usage, which would also benefit from the change in deadline from October to December, as currently we are sort of forecasting that would only be 3 months of data if we brought the report back in October, and that would be inclusive of the summer holiday period. This report makes the following recommendations to committee: that the scope of work be agreed and officers instructed to commence work, and that the report of the outcomes be brought to the committee in December alongside the measures of success or otherwise of Park and Ride.
Thank you very much. I'm only seeing Councillor English at the moment, or is that you as well? No. Over to you, Councillor English.
My apologies. Right. Okay. I think there's slight ambiguity in paragraph 1.7, because if you read it literally, it would be ruling out looking at bus services as well. But I assume that's not what we mean. And it's merely ruling out looking at certain Park and Ride options, but you can see why it reads slightly ambiguously. So if we can clarify that. Now, I've said this at various times. Part of the overall scope of looking at sustainable transport must be parking, car parking. That must include both on and off-street parking. If we're looking at the whole issue of the the borough, including rural service centres, looking at how we handle residents' car parking is relevant and needs to be part of the discussion, because it affects demand for parking and also it will affect how many people make a journey by car or by an alternative method. So that really does need factoring in. And returning to the other issue, which I flagged up earlier about technological change, future-proofing and the low emission strategy, we do have to look at how we actually structure going forward parking charges, whatever the level are, whatever overall level we set them at. There must be a way of using modern technology to make the most polluting vehicles pay more and to incentivise moving towards less environmentally damaging vehicles. And we really should be taking the opportunity, if we re-examine the essentials of our strategy, to actually do that. So that's two things. Within and what modal shift is a term I'm not going to use because it's so unpopular and so misunderstood. But if we are going to look at encouraging walking and cycling as part of the strategy, although I think buses and are more relevant here. But if we are going to improve people's walking and cycling, we do have to examine the public safety issue, and that's where we come back to one of the vexed issues around, for example, 20-mile-an-hour zones, not by themselves, but as part of a measure to actually improve the popularity of walking and cycling. Now, I'm not saying, so that's three things that I think do need to be considered. Beyond that, I would say that we've got to be careful that we are actually looking at this in a radical way. I imagine there'll probably be more. What we can't do is get to the end of this process, fiddle around with it, and frankly do nothing particularly radical, because we do need to have a strategy that will deliver sustainable alternative transport proposals that are robust for the foreseeable future. And obviously the parking charges are part of that, on and off street parking are part of that, public safety is an element in that, and I would hope that we would actually, I'm not drawing the conclusions, but I would hope in scoping we would actually be ambitious and try and radical, and not just try and do what we've always done in the past.
I quite enjoyed parts of that. It's almost like sensible parking. Yes, it's got to be a key element. Electric vehicle provision, low emissions, absolutely on with that. Park and train is one of the phrases here, and without being too town centre centric. Well, I wear that hat, the Marden and Yalding one. Commuter use of the train service there is massive. People drive to Marden to get the train. That does take pressure off of the town centre, but the parking consequence of that is massive, is enormous. That ought to be a theme in this. Anyway, Councillor Mrs Wilson, and then heading round.
Well, I'm a little bit confused by this report, because it seems to be, for me, it seems to be conflating two different things. Listening to and being part of the debate on the park and ride, I knew that we'd asked for a report on the park and ride because it had become a huge budget issue. I can't see, despite the fact that I know that this committee has been talking about all of this for absolutely ever, I can't see how, by that time scale, you can truly look at all the options to move forward to really get transportation or not sorted out in this borough. There doesn't seem to be... I've read, the first words I read almost were cycling and walking. I'm sick of cycling and walking. I don't cycle, but I walk all the time. I actually want to hear more about pay to ride, express bus services, what you've talked about, how you link trains to buses, how you link trains to car parking, how you link... and I can't see that after all the talk that's been going on in this committee for a year, that we've actually got to the point where we're saying, let's be innovative, let's think outside the box, it seems to be still hidebound with what we've been looking at for a very long time. And I'm sure officers have got some really exciting ideas tucked away that if we let them fly, I don't mean literally like Peter Pan, but if we let them, although maybe you'd like to, that if we let them fly, we find that there are things that are being done around the country or even abroad that would be things that we could think about adopting here or bringing in here. So I just, when I read this report, I thought, I'm not sure what I'm looking at here. Is it the response that we need so quickly in relation to our concerns about the budgeting implications of the 2 park and rides we've got? Or is it meant to be the really innovative moving forward? How do we move forward with our integrated transport system for the review? And they just, you see what I'm saying? So I'd really like a clear answer on that, and I would personally like to recommend that we try and encourage our officers to fly and actually come up with some really radical, interesting ways of doing things.
Councillor, Mrs. Arnold first.
I think there is a need to balance in terms of the timescales. If the decision, when this report returns in October or December, is that the committee decides that Park and Ride is not delivering what our expectations are of it, that members are also presented with some short-term, deliverable alternatives. So the purposes of the scope that I've outlined here is so that when that decision is made, you have a range of choices which you can make an informed decision about whether or not to continue to invest in Park and Ride or another alternative that is basically immediately available that Maidstone can help facilitate its delivery. I certainly wouldn't want to prevent the longer term potential options being explored as well, but what we've looked to capture here is to deal with some of the criticisms I think we had when the Park and Ride report came, that members sort of indicated they didn't feel they'd been given a sufficient choice. It was Park and Ride or not, as opposed to Park and Ride or one of these options. So yes, you are right, that the scope predominantly looks at short-term options and delivering what we've already committed to in the ITS. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be an additional piece of work looking at some slightly longer-term solutions, some more innovative solutions, which would form part, I would imagine, of the local plan review and review of the integrated transport strategy.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just come back very briefly then. Mr. Chairman, if I can just come back very briefly then, I think we have to make it crystal clear then that we are talking about the 2 park and rides we've got and what may or may not happen to them and what alternatives there are. But we've also got to make it clear that the borough is wider than the 2 town park and rides. That's the point I'm trying to get at. And our transportation issues are borough-wide, and we have to actually look at those and come up with something other than walking. I'm for walking and cycling, but I can't see how I could possibly walk to Headcorn.
I think we've got that. Could Mr. Jarman chip in and then back to you?
Yes, really, I was going to raise the same points as Councillor Wilson. As I understand it, what we're seeking to do is 2 things, something very specific for people who use the Park and Ride now, but also another report which presumably would feed into the review of the local plan for something... No.
What? Mrs. Arnold. Back to you.
Where I said short-term options, it's about mitigating against providing options for that number of cars that are currently taken off the road by Park and Ride so that we don't see an increase in congestion by that number. The scope here is not just about dealing with the existing Park and Ride users, but it's ensuring that we don't actually increase the congestion and you're presented with a range of decisions as to how you might wish to invest the money that you currently do removing those cars from town centre journeys.
Right.
See, I think, Mr. Chairman, there's confusion here.
There's confusion, and I think we're about to draw that out because we've got 3 officers all wanting to contribute here. So, Mr. Cornell, Mr. Jarman, and then back if you need to add any more, Mrs. Arnold.
Yeah, thank you. What I was very keen to do is that, obviously the council's putting money or subsidy into sustainable transport, modal shift, whatever we call it at the moment, and I think whatever alternatives we look at, we kind of peg it to the same level of subsidy, and we're not saying what we're trying to do is to provide an alternative for the people that currently use the park and ride services now, but we're saying, how can we get a better bang for our buck through different means? That's my...
I'm going to come in at that point, because I think part of our motivation here has been recognising we do not, moving forwards, have budget to keep putting in to a measure of sustainable transport. And we've actually got to wean ourselves off of that subsidy. And I think the thing that I find most frustrating is that our ITS is actually quite a comprehensive document, and we do seem to have had a fixation on park and ride. And when we've talked, as Mrs Wilson mentioned earlier, about developing new radial bus routes, from where a humble member sits, it looks like the progress has been zilch, and there's no tangible on the table of we're talking to and it's happening. So that's, it isn't about, so if I'm summarising this correctly for members, it's not about taking our £250,000 a year and seeing how else we could spend it. It's about actually looking at a sustainable budget moving forwards and an improved transport approach. Come back if you wish.
I think, it's going to severely limit the options, to go to a point of subsidy to zero subsidy in one stretch and try and do something innovative. What will those options be realistically? I'd have to...
Well, that's why we've asked for this report. And taking the most simple measure, there was a suggestion that you could keep these sites, park for £1 and catch the bus. And I don't know whether we've had the conversations with the bus, or this is about setting up the conversations with the bus companies to address those issues we were talking about earlier, that it's a commercial bus service of a frequency that actually is fit for purpose, that allows people to use their concessionary fares where appropriate, and possibly even generates a small income from parking. It's the same thing turned around completely. That's one option I'd like looked at within this. Might not have legs, but let's look at some numbers on a piece of paper and make a judgment. Mr. Jarman.
I was going to agree with yourself and William. I'm just very conscious wearing my local plan hat and my development management hat that we've got very specific proposals which, Councillor Willis mentioned the bus loop. I think that was in the local plan 5 years ago, quite frankly. I'm also aware that over £400,000 has gone towards it. I can think of millions of pounds. So I think it'd be folly to sort of reinvent the wheel on certain things. The reason I picked on the local plan review and going back to SIL 123, as William said, if you want more imaginative solutions in a SIL regime, then they need, the 123 list needs to be changed as soon as possible. Otherwise, you won't have the money to go into these imaginative...
And I think that's completely important, and local plan review should be picking that up. The purpose of this report is to evaluate the changes that we made to Park and Ride to see whether they've stimulated further use or not, and to offer some alternatives if our successors at this committee during the next municipal year come to conclusions that say we need to do something differently. And we mustn't lose that focus short term compared to the longer term review aspirations. Is that fair to say? Right, Councillor English, Councillor Mrs Wilson.
One potential option would actually be that even if the park and ride situation were to be improved, that alternative methods would be superior. And I really think we ought to be careful not to rule out things. And the entire list of what we've talked about should be in there at this stage, and we shouldn't be ruling things out, in or out. We should be having a proper scoping review, and I think, frankly, we should be looking at it from the point of view of the best outcome and not picking an arbitrary figure of subsidy level or expenditure. We should be aiming for a sustainable way forward, and that might be a number of different ways, but picking the figure you want to arrive at arbitrarily before we do all the work is not the right way of doing it. It's the wrong way round. And similarly, whilst I think local plan review is important, Mr. Jarman is right. We need to identify some of these measures before we even get to a local plan review, because if we don't, it'll be a bit late to actually do that, frankly.
Or put it another way, we're actually in a delivery phase of the local plan now. We have an ITS, it says certain things, and my concern is we haven't got on with most of them.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I wasn't trying to change what we've already got, but I just felt that in the way this was written, I thought it was conflating the two. And so I'm not saying that we should close down what we're looking, in fact, far from it. I'm saying we should, as Councillor English says, we should be looking at all the options in the round, but realise that it is linked very firmly to the decisions that came out of this committee over the park and ride. So, do you see what I'm saying? And then you go back to the local, if I can put it that way, you go back to the local plan and the review of the local plan to actually get the broader brushstroke, because you don't just look at a local plan in we're going to have 50 more houses. You look at the review of the local plan in how do we make it all sustainable throughout the borough. And when I read in here about, I have to say it, for cycling and walking, yes, I mean, some of us might like to walk from Allington into the town or whatever, but actually that really isn't part really of the park and ride. Yes, you'll look at it. Maybe you could have a better cycle route or whatever. But it was trying to say, while you're honing in on the park and ride issue, it should be comprehensive, but it shouldn't be conflated with the wider borough-wide issues. And I couldn't see from this report, I just felt that they'd mixed the two up, is what I'm saying. I'm not trying to ask you to change what you're doing, but to be comprehensive, but not to conflate them in a report, because I just felt you did, basically.
Okay, I think we're all in grave danger of saying the same thing now. So I think the scope is there. I will come around to the other side in a moment. The other part of this, let's face it up, is the timing of this report. Now, Councillor Mrs Wilson, you were very firm when we were looking at this that within 6 months we should have something, and that we would be front-footed with a decision-making process to continue or otherwise, because there are contractual obligations, and if there are alternative measures to bring online, as we've already experienced, beginning of 1 month actually turns into be, or the end of 1 month turns into be in the beginning of the following month, and it all slides. So October, I think, was the original proposal, and we're being faced with December here. And I do worry, let's be realistic, this can become political, and that gets awfully close to next May. And I favour bringing this forwards, or holding it, if we can, to the October timescale. I don't actually think you're going to get substantially better data by holding on another couple of months. You'd need a whole year's data to really look at this in the whole, but we'd have a jolly good feel within a few months of whether it's made a difference or not.
Mr. Chairman, I said I wouldn't say another word. I asked a specific question about whether we could get the necessary orders and everything in place to enable us to do it in October, to which the answer was yes. Apparently that slipped. The critical issue here isn't politics. The critical issue is when we set our budgets. And so if it can't be October, I think December's a bit late because of budget setting. I'd split the difference and say November, no later, because it's the budget that is really the critical issue.
Budgets are political, but yes. So what we are saying then is December is too late. November, worst case scenario. Yeah, there's aim for October, but we'll accept November. I mean, it'll be October data prepared for a November report, let's face it. Yeah. Mr. Cornell.
Yeah, just returning to the previous point, can I be clear then that we are looking for sort of zero cost to the council solutions here? Because, you know, we could be talking trams at the one end of the spectrum, couldn't we? You know, and, you know, just sort of working through the city.
Look, I think we're going to go over the same territory again. We're looking for short-term deliverable alternatives to Park and Ride. Councillor English, sorry, if you would, please. We're going to go over the same repetition of what we've just been saying. You know, we're looking for a report to say what has happened to Park and Ride with the change in the charging arrangements, and that report will have options, continue, go back to how it was, or other short-term deliverable alternatives instead of. And the bigger piece of work carries on in the background. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that, does it?
I do want a promise that we will look at the parking issues, both sets of parking issues, as part of this whole process, because you cannot possibly look at integrated transport without dealing with that issue.
No, I agree with you, but the initial is a focus on park. Yeah, I'm on the same page with you there. Let me see if there's any comment from this side. Councillor Mrs. Springett, did you want to?
Oh, yes, please. Right, first of all, I'm not happy with the date going back, and I'm wondering whether we could, rather than defer it to November, whether we could split it in two, because it says alternative sustainable transport measures. Park and Ride is one of those, and everything else is another one of those. So why can we not have the options on everything else brought to us in October, and then we'll have the review on what Park and Ride changes have costed in December, so we actually don't slip too much, but we've looked at the alternatives before we've got to where we are with Park and Ride. So first of all, I'd like to throw that one in the pot. Secondly, I'd like to suggest, on a little bit concerned, 1.6, paragraph 1, replacing existing dedicated Park and Ride bus services with existing urban bus services was also reviewed. The review confirmed that the services near Willington Street are too few, not equally spaced and not close enough to provide an attractive service. So that we've just thrown that one out the window, according to 1.7. Yeah, so we've thrown that out the window. So
I think the key emphasis is existing bus services. Right. That's not to say
exactly
that reviewed, revised, improved alternatives are thrown out.
If we didn't have a Park and Ride bus, but we had a bus stop outside, we get the Bearsted bus service split back into two, which would be a huge improvement, and the south bus stop, the south bus route then stops via there. You've instantly got an issue. I'd also like to say I'm going to go completely outside the box here. Boris Bikes, a Boris Bike system in Willington Street, a Segway hire in Willington Street, electric scooters. Can we not think outside the box? Surely you'd be a system to register, pay a deposit to be part of a scheme to use a Segway, and let's have dedicated Segway track through Moat Park. You don't need to put 20 mile an hour on the road. Have a dedicated Segway, electric scooter, electric tuk-tuks. They're going to be really off the scale. But Boris Bikes, can we not investigate Boris Bikes and a scheme whereby you have to register a card, pay a huge deposit to make sure you carefully lock it up where you leave it, because you can cycle through the park. That's healthy, that's quick, and doesn't need a Park and Ride bus. And it's safe, exactly. So I'd like to see a little bit of thinking outside the box, really, but I do think we should split this into two and ask for the alternatives to come back in October, and then the review of where we are with Park and Ride in December, because by then we'll know what the alternatives are.
And don't forget about the backup measures on the 150 days when it rains. Mrs Arnold.
Just to provide a little bit of clarification, and again come back to Councillor English's point, the only element that has been dismissed is within the parameters that the previous study looked at it. So it was just on the stop running the Park and Ride bus and make use of the existing timetable and provision that's currently there. It's not to preclude or prevent any discussions with any of the providers as to what potentially, with some facilitation or support by Maidstone Borough Council, might be an alternative that could be progressed. And just around the borough spikes, obviously we've flagged cycling and walking and sorry, Councillor Wilson, as a potential sustainable option, and it would be looking at options to increase and facilitate an increase in cycling and walking if the report indicated that having bikes for hire would increase that, or cycle training or anything else. That would be something I would expect the report to cover.
Quickly, yeah.
I agree with Councillor Wilson. I'm afraid I don't get on a bicycle much. Mums can't do the weekly shop on the bicycle, and when it's tipping with rain, it doesn't work. So it's a great idea. So I have to say I'm slightly sceptical on that. And the other point's gone straight out of my head, so I'll come back in a minute.
Let's try and wrap this up now. Sorry, you're in transparent. But if the label turns this way, I can see it.
Well, that debate's even made me more giddy. And I was getting giddy for a start. So I assume we're going to evaluate the Park and Ride with options. What I'm concerned about here is we're going back round and round the circles, and this will end up as a sticky plaster. Who is doing the sustainable transport options and looking at that? Like 3 of this committee spent a year doing. We wrote a report 6 years ago, and it's probably never been open since we wrote it. There was secure cycle path parking to enable villages like mine to cycle to a main bus route. There was oodles on it. Val was the chairman, Clive was on it, and we met nearly every week. Who is doing that work? Or, Mr. Jarman, when are we going to start implementing that work that was done 5 or 6 years ago? Yeah, evaluate the Park and Ride. Give us some options there, but they shouldn't be nil cost. They should not be nil cost. If we have a Park and a Ride, it possibly will cost something, but it will provide a lot cleaner air, etc., and all the benefits. Councils do provide services at costs, so we shouldn't be looking at nil cost. But who is doing the sustainable transport report to this committee? Not just a sticky plaster, having a look at Park and Ride and giving us options.
Mr. Jarman.
I'm going to repeat largely what you've said a couple of times, Chairman. As I've said, and we argued these points in this very chamber some time ago now, we have very, very specific policies in the local plan already. On top of that, we have, in my opinion, rather large sums of money to deliver those sustainable transport improvements. It's a matter of delivering them. Well, they are identified in the local plan to the point, and obviously developers don't hand over large sums of money without knowing exactly what they're handing the money over for. So it is, to my mind, a lot of this is actually getting on with the delivery. So unless you want another strategy.
If I can resharpen that question and say then, so in your view, what is stopping the delivery?
I think the monies, we are not the infrastructure provider in terms of improving the road system to make it more convenient for bus transport, just as an example. However, and this is a timing issue, I can think of a number of schemes, one large scheme in particular, where we will collect money in the future when houses get occupied for subsidised bus transport. So it's a timing issue and it's a control issue in terms of the delivery.
I think we need to wrap this up.
I just want to come quickly back on what Mr. Cornwall said. He was saying, has this got to be zero cost or whatever? I think you're looking at about, you need to look at it arse about face, if you excuse my term. You find the solution, then you work out how you do it. Because actually, if we could find a solution that solved our congestion, improved our air quality, I think we'd all be happy for the council to fund it. So I think it's looking at it the other way. I think we have to find the solutions first, and then we work out what the cost is, and then we work out whether we're contributing or it has to be zero cost. So,
all right, but let's come back to ground zero. The reason we're having this conversation is we have a measure in place, and I think if you work the numbers back, £1,250 per car per year peak travel off the road. In my evaluation, that is appalling use of public money, public funds. And that's why we're revisiting this, to see what can be done better.
Mr. Chairman, on that point, Mr. Cornell is looking for a steer, and I think the road is down the middle. I'm sorry to say that. We cannot afford the subsidy we currently are underpinning it with. That is a given. We cannot afford it. But equally, it's highly unlikely that you would find a solution immediately that was absolutely cost zero. So I don't agree entirely. But I do think your starting point is probably right, because you look for the solutions, and if you find a really good solution, then you cost it. Then you say, well, actually, we can't. It's the best solution, but or how are we going to afford it? Or actually, it's a good solution, but there is no way we can afford it, so we go on to the next one. So I don't want you to get the idea that you've got to look for something that absolutely is zero. But we do have to have very great common sense in here that we haven't got limitless funds, and we are going to have. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be bothering with this at all, would we? We'd just be keeping the park and ride going as it currently is and just propping it up all the time. So we can't do that. But a common sense approach is what we're looking for, if we can find it.
We'll try and come to a conclusion. So there are some words on the. Councillor Willis?
I do a lot of work on transport. I'm sorry to... Obviously, this is one reason why I voted for a local plan, is it had a sustainable transport element, and the reason why is I've looked on quite a lot of doors across Maidstone, the urban part of Maidstone, to be frank, so I accept there's village issues as well to go with it. And the biggest issue that comes up, which I take pride that my daughter lives in Maidstone, the biggest issue that comes up, and I'll explain why I take pride, the biggest issue that comes up is congestion. And the reason why I take pride is the town where I've grown up, Gravesham, is not the biggest issue, it's poverty, frankly. Maidstone is a nice place to live, it's a decent place, and the one thing that if the biggest problem is traffic, then let's deal with it. Let's sort it out. Let's really try and do something about it. And I'm sorry to say this, as far as I understand, I think probably to deal with congestion and to get modal shift and encourage middle of England people to actually use decent public transport, you actually need to pay for it a bit. You need a bit of subsidy. Wherever it comes from, whether it comes from parking, whether it comes from people's tax, and that's their choice in how they vote. When we've agreed by a majority to keep the subsidy for park and ride at the moment and review it. But you need to do that. And that's the first point. The second point is Councillor Mumford asked who's going to do this work. I think that's what you were asking. Yeah. Can we ask that question? And I've got a third point of question, please.
I'd like to try and address that within a wrapping up motion, okay? And since I've got the microphone, I'm going to actually say I disagree with you fundamentally. This isn't about a taxpayer paying more money to get people to go onto a bus. It's about carrot and stick. And I know you've referred to the work Overview and Scrutiny did some time ago. If you went back a cycle, we did another piece, which we summarised on one A4 piece of paper. And it actually talked about carrot and stick. And that committee at that time, and I think this has been borne through since, concluded that we did not support stick. The only way you'll get people on the bus is to beat them with a stick and make it so damned expensive they can't even get the car out of the garage, so they're left with only that alternative. And funnily enough, that pays for the bus anyway.
Who said a bus? But walking, cycling, using the river, the rail. It doesn't just have to be a bus.
Unaffordable to use your car. It's stick. And actually, we concluded in that Overview and Scrutiny that what we believed in was carrot, carrot, and more carrot. We'll encourage cycling. We'll encourage walking. We'll encourage bus services. It's in our plan, new radial routes. But we won't beat the motorist, and we'll take measures, as Councillor English has suggested, with parking, for example, to make the motorists a sustainable option as well, a necessary option in many cases. So I fundamentally disagree with what you're saying. It's not about throwing money at it.
I didn't actually say that. I said it takes money. Where the money comes from, it's not throwing it at it. Where the money comes from is dependent on how it's generated. The second point I had, and I have waited, is Kent are the Transport Authority. There's some brilliant officers at Kent that could help us if we choose to do that. We've got brilliant officers that also have good networking ability. We're going to talk about how this is delivered and how we get to a report that comes up with some sensible ideas. I'll go back to my original point. The biggest thing that comes up on the doorstep, as far as I'm concerned, I hear about Maidstone, I think as a compliment actually, because it's a lovely place to live, is transport and congestion. And sustainable transport could alleviate that in the urban area. We've really got to throw everything at this and find a way, even asking our friends in other authorities to perhaps actually for once work with us and help. It's one of the most important things that we could do. It's been 5 years we've been working on this.
Very briefly, there is the intention to bring a cycling and walking update on the delivery of the strategy as part of over the next set of committee meetings in June, which will actually highlight some of the good work that's been done working proactively with Kent County Council officers. And actually, in reference to Councillor Mumford's suggestion several years ago at Scrutiny Committee about alternatives to the motor vehicle and having cycle routes and secure parking at bus stops to allow people to get the buses in where they felt uncomfortable. We have actually discussed that, and I'm quite happy to share the minutes from the meeting with KCC where we actually picked that up as an item and looked at potential ways in terms of progressing that. So they have been followed up.
I'm going to try and sum this up now. So we've got some words on the papers, but I think that the first point that we need to agree is that based upon the discussion, the scope for work be agreed and officers instructed to commence work. Yes? So you'll need to refer to the webcast because we're not going to be able to get all of the key words down. But based on the discussion tonight, get on with it. Yes? Secondly, that at an early opportunity, an update be given to this committee on progress with delivery of the ITS. So it's a little bit separate to the park and ride issue, but those bigger strands of work, that's separate. And then the third point is that the report come to this committee, the report from item 1, come to this committee in November, I think was the compromise date. Should have been October, it's offered December, but we're actually asking for, and I know there was a suggestion of splitting it, but I think you'd need the later bit first, because if you actually had really good news on Park and Ride, you may not need to make any short-term changes. Do you see what I mean? So we could, it needs to come together. You know, have the revised measures helped and improved patronage? If so, options to continue. If not, options alternative. So November. So I think they're the 3 points. I'll move that from the chair. Is there a seconder, Councillor? Oh. Right. Okay, I've moved it, but you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think what's been brought out tonight is that there are a lot of ideas. We shouldn't cut them off, and also that there is the ability to deliver. But with the report that's given to us in October, we must not only be told about the report and what they found, but how to deliver it, the ability to deliver it, and what needs unlocking. Because at the moment, nobody's saying the terrible words over who's controlling the money. And we need to get that out there, because the people watching this think that we control the money and we're ruining the town and we're causing all the congestion when it's not us. And the quicker we find that out and get that out to the people watching this, that sometimes it's not our responsibility because we haven't got the purse strings. And yes, we need to think outside the box. Yes, I think it's a good idea that we work on this straight away, because some of this will take a long time to get the information, and as we receive it, we might have further questions to bring to officers so that we do get all the information when it's prudent that we make a decision that goes out to the public. Because sometimes it might be perceived that we haven't been given all the information, and I think it's very important that we do see all options. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I'm hoping that second point captures that as a very separate thing, to be not confused with our shorter-term deliberations on Park and Ride. I've moved that. I think Councillor Wigginen had got there earlier. Those in favour? Unanimous, therefore carried. Thank you. That does indeed conclude our agenda for this evening. This is our last meeting of this municipal year. Our successors, whoever they may be, post-May, will be here. If any of us are up for re-election, I wish you good luck. And I think it's also our opportunity to thank Councillor Willis for his contribution, particularly in transport matters over this last year or so. I think you've chosen not to stand for re-election, so this is your last meeting. Thank you very much. And to all the officers this evening, thank you, and the meeting is closed.